The coffee mug slipped from my trembling hands and shattered against the marble floor of the executive conference room, sending hot liquid and ceramic fragments across the polished surface like shrapnel from an explosion. 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me, some filled with pity, others with barely concealed satisfaction, but all of them witnessing the moment my carefully constructed professional facade finally cracked under the weight of what I had just heard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Chen, my former subordinate who had somehow transformed into my new supervisor overnight, stood at the head of the mahogany table wearing a Chanel blazer that cost more than my monthly rent and a smile that didn't quite reach her calculating eyes. Behind her, the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor offered a breathtaking view of downtown Seattle, but all I could see was the reflection of my own shocked face staring back at me like a stranger. "I'm so sorry, Emma," Sarah said, her voice dripping with the kind of false concern that made my skin crawl. "I know this promotion announcement must come as quite a surprise, but Mr. Harrison felt that the Pacific Northwest expansion project needed someone with fresh perspectives and innovative approaches." She gestured toward our boss, David Harrison, who sat at the opposite end of the table avoiding my gaze like a guilty child caught stealing cookies. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman who had spent the last 18 months asking me to explain basic financial concepts was now being presented as the innovative visionary who would lead our most important strategic initiative. Sarah Chen, who had somehow managed to get hired despite having a resume full of gaps and references that seemed suspiciously difficult to verify, was now the regional director of operations while I remained stuck in my senior financial analyst position like a fly trapped in amber. As I knelt to pick up the pieces of my broken mug, my mind raced through the events that had led to this moment of professional humiliation. 6 months ago, I had submitted a comprehensive proposal for the Pacific Northwest expansion, complete with market analysis, financial projections, and implementation timelines that had taken me weeks of overtime work to perfect. David had praised my thoroughness and assured me that my dedication would be remembered when promotion opportunities arose. 3 months ago, I had single-handedly identified and prevented a major accounting error that would have cost the company nearly $2 million in regulatory fines. And just last month, I had successfully negotiated a contract renewal with our largest client, securing terms that exceeded everyone's expectations and generated substantial additional revenue. Yet here I was, watching Sarah bask in the congratulations of our colleagues while I cleaned coffee stains off the floor like some kind of corporate janitor. The symbolism was so heavy-handed it felt like a scene from a bad office drama, but the sting of humiliation was completely real. My name is Emma Rodriguez, and 6 months ago I thought I understood how the world worked. I believed that hard work, competence, and integrity were the keys to professional success. I trusted that merit would eventually triumph over politics, that dedication would be rewarded, and that the systems designed to promote excellence actually functioned as advertised. I was naive in the way that only a 29-year-old who had never encountered real corporate corruption could be naive. Growing up in a working-class family in Tacoma, I had learned the value of education and persistence from parents who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they never had. My father worked double shifts at the Boeing plant while my mother cleaned office buildings at night, both of them determined that their daughter would have a different kind of life. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college, earning my degree in finance from the University of Washington with a combination of academic scholarships, student loans, and part-time jobs that left me exhausted but determined. Landing a position at Morrison Financial Services straight out of college felt like winning the lottery. Morrison was one of Seattle's most prestigious financial consulting firms, the kind of place where ambitious young professionals came to build careers that would set them up for life. The company specialized in helping mid-sized businesses navigate complex financial challenges, from mergers and acquisitions to restructuring and expansion planning. It was exactly the kind of intellectually demanding, professionally rewarding work I had dreamed about during those long nights studying in the university library. For 5 years, I had thrown myself into the job with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from genuinely loving what you do. I arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for challenging assignments, and gradually built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with the firm's most important clients. My analyses were thorough, my recommendations were sound, and my track record of successful project outcomes spoke for itself. Colleagues sought my advice, clients requested me specifically for their accounts, and senior partners praised my work in performance reviews that consistently rated me as exceeding expectations. The Morrison Financial Services office occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown high-rise, with modern furnishings and sophisticated technology that conveyed success and competence to visiting clients. My desk sat in the middle of the analyst bullpen, a open concept space designed to encourage collaboration and communication among the junior and mid-level staff. From my workstation, I could see into the glass-walled offices of the senior partners, including David Harrison's corner suite with its impressive collection of awards and photographs documenting his rise through the corporate hierarchy. David had been my mentor since my second year at the firm, taking an interest in my career development that I had initially interpreted as recognition of my potential. He was 45 years old, tall, and distinguished in the way that successful men often become as they age into their authority. His silver-streaked hair and expensive suits conveyed gravitas and competence, while his easy charm and quick wit made him popular with both clients and staff. During my annual reviews, he would speak glowingly about my analytical skills and professional dedication, often hinting that bigger opportunities were coming for employees who demonstrated the kind of commitment I had shown. Looking back now, I realized there were warning signs that I either missed or chose to ignore. David's praise always seemed to come with subtle suggestions about my appearance or demeanor, comments about how I might consider updating my wardrobe or adjusting my communication style to better fit the firm's culture. He would invite me to client dinners and industry events, opportunities that I welcomed as chances to build my professional network and demonstrate my capabilities in high-stakes environments. But these invitations always came with an undercurrent of personal attention that made me slightly uncomfortable, though I told myself it was simply his way of mentoring promising employees. The trouble began about 18 months ago when Chen joined our team as a financial associate, a position typically reserved for recent graduates or professionals with minimal experience. Sarah's background was unusual for someone joining a prestigious firm like Morrison. Her resume listed previous positions at smaller companies in different industries, with employment gaps that raised questions about her career trajectory. During her interview process, I had been asked to evaluate her technical knowledge and was surprised by how little she seemed to understand about basic financial principles and analytical methods. When I mentioned my concerns to David, he dismissed them with a wave of his hand and a comment about how sometimes the best employees were those who brought fresh perspectives rather than traditional qualifications. Sarah had impressed him with her enthusiasm and her ideas about modernizing the firm's approach to client relations, he explained. She would be assigned to work under my supervision initially, giving me the opportunity to help her develop the technical skills she might be lacking while learning from her innovative thinking about business development. I accepted this arrangement without complaint, viewing it as a chance to demonstrate my leadership abilities while helping a colleague succeed. Sarah was undeniably attractive, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested expensive maintenance and careful attention to image management. She dressed impeccably, spoke confidently, and had a way of making everyone in the room feel like they were the most important person in her world when she focused her attention on them. But beneath the sophisticated exterior, I quickly discovered significant gaps in her understanding of fundamental financial concepts. During our first week working together, I spent hours explaining basic principles of cash flow analysis, risk assessment, and regulatory compliance. Sarah listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and expressed gratitude for my patience in bringing her up to speed. She was a quick learner when it came to absorbing information, but I noticed that she seemed more interested in understanding the political dynamics of our client relationships than the technical details of our analytical work. Sarah had an uncanny ability to identify the key decision-makers in any organization and focus her energy on building personal connections with them. While I would be buried in spreadsheets and financial models, she would be charming clients over expensive lunches and finding ways to insert herself into high-level strategic discussions. Her approach was completely different from my own methodical focus on technical competence, but I had to admit it was effective in its own way. The first red flag should have been obvious in retrospect. During a client presentation for Cascade Manufacturing, one of our largest accounts, Sarah took credit for analysis that I had spent weeks developing. The presentation went smoothly, with the client expressing satisfaction with our recommendations and agreeing to move forward with the proposed restructuring plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But when the partners discussed the project's success in our weekly team meeting, Sarah was praised for her innovative approach and client management skills while my contribution was barely acknowledged. When I approached David privately to discuss the misattribution, he suggested that I might be misunderstanding the collaborative nature of our work environment. Teams succeed together, he explained, and worrying too much about individual credit could be counterproductive to building strong working relationships. Sarah had done an excellent job presenting our findings to the client, he continued, and her ability to communicate complex information clearly was exactly the kind of skill the firm valued in its rising stars. I left that conversation feeling confused and slightly betrayed, but I told myself that David was probably right about focusing on team success rather than individual recognition. Maybe I was being petty by caring about who got credit for specific pieces of work. Maybe my concerns were a sign that I needed to think more strategically about how my contributions fit into the bigger picture of client relationships and business development. Over the following months, this pattern repeated itself with increasing frequency. Sarah would observe my work, ask detailed questions about my methodologies and findings, and then present refined versions of my analyses in settings where I wasn't present. She had a talent for taking technical information and packaging it in ways that made complex financial concepts accessible to non-experts, a skill that impressed both clients and senior partners. Meanwhile, I found myself increasingly relegated to the background, performing the detailed analytical work while Sarah served as the public face of our team's capabilities. The situation became more complicated when I began to notice Sarah's growing closeness with David. Their working relationship seemed to extend well beyond normal business hours, with frequent private meetings in his office and client dinners that somehow never included other team members. Sarah would mention casually that she and David had discussed various strategic initiatives over weekend dinners or during conference calls that occurred outside of regular office hours. When I asked about participating in these discussions, I was told that they were preliminary conversations that would be formalized through proper channels once the concepts were more fully developed. David's behavior toward me began to change as well. The mentorship and encouragement that had characterized our previous interactions were gradually replaced by subtle criticisms and suggestions for improvement. He questioned my communication skills, suggested that I might benefit from additional training in client relations, and hinted that my focus on technical details sometimes prevented me from seeing bigger strategic opportunities. During performance reviews, he praised my analytical capabilities but noted areas for growth in leadership and business development that seemed designed to justify passing me over for advancement opportunities. The most frustrating aspect of this evolving dynamic was how difficult it was to address directly. When I tried to discuss my concerns with human resources, I was told that Sarah's rapid advancement was a reflection of her exceptional performance and natural leadership abilities. The fact that she had managed to excel so quickly despite her limited technical background was presented as evidence of her unique talents rather than a cause for suspicion. My complaints about being excluded from strategic discussions were characterized as resistance to change and difficulty adapting to evolving team structures. I began to feel like I was losing my mind, questioning my own perceptions and wondering if my frustrations were simply the result of professional jealousy rather than legitimate concerns about unfair treatment. Sarah was unfailingly polite and supportive in our direct interactions, often praising my technical skills and expressing appreciation for my mentorship. She would invite me to lunch and ask for my advice about various projects, creating an atmosphere of collaboration that made it difficult to articulate exactly what was wrong with our working relationship. But the evidence of favoritism became impossible to ignore when David announced the formation of a special task force to develop the Pacific Northwest expansion strategy. This was exactly the kind of high-profile project that could launch a career to the next level, involving market research, financial modeling, and strategic planning that would shape the firm's growth for years to come. I had been working on preliminary analysis for this expansion for months, developing comprehensive reports on market opportunities and competitive landscapes that demonstrated both the potential rewards and the significant risks involved. When the task force was announced, I assumed I would be included based on my existing work and obvious expertise in the relevant areas. Instead, Sarah was appointed as the lead analyst while I was assigned to provide technical support for her strategic recommendations. The appointment was presented as recognition of Sarah's innovative thinking and proven ability to manage complex client relationships, qualities that would be essential for successful expansion into new markets. I spent the next 3 months watching Sarah take my research, repackage my findings, and present my strategic recommendations as her own original thinking. She would schedule meetings with senior partners to discuss expansion opportunities, using PowerPoint presentations that incorporated charts and analysis I had developed but presenting the information as the result of her independent investigation. When partners praised her thorough research and strategic insights, she would graciously accept the compliments while making vague references to the collaborative efforts of the entire team. The breaking point came when I discovered that Sarah had been sharing confidential information about our expansion plans with competitors. While organizing files for a client presentation, I found emails in David's shared folder that revealed ongoing communications between Sarah and executives at rival firms. The correspondence suggested that Sarah was providing detailed information about our strategic initiatives in exchange for consideration for potential positions at their companies. She was essentially conducting a job search using inside information about Morrison Financial Services' most sensitive business plans. When I brought this discovery to David's attention, his reaction was swift and shocking. Instead of expressing concern about the security breach, he accused me of violating privacy policies by accessing confidential communications without authorization. He suggested that my discovery of these emails was evidence of jealousy and unprofessional behavior rather than legitimate whistleblowing about corporate espionage. The meeting ended with a formal reprimand being placed in my personnel file and a warning that future violations of company policy would result in termination. That night, I sat in my small Capitol Hill apartment reviewing everything that had happened over the previous 18 months, trying to understand how my promising career had deteriorated so rapidly. The evidence was overwhelming that Sarah was receiving preferential treatment based on her personal relationship with David rather than her professional qualifications. But every attempt I made to address the situation through proper channels was dismissed or redirected back to my own supposed shortcomings and attitude problems. I realized that I was facing a choice between accepting an increasingly untenable situation or taking more drastic action to protect my career and expose the corruption that was undermining the firm's integrity. The decision became easier when I remembered something my father had told me years earlier during a conversation about workplace ethics. Sometimes, he had said, the most important thing you can do is stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Especially when it's difficult or dangerous. The next morning, I began documenting everything I could find about Sarah's questionable hiring, her rapid advancement despite obvious incompetence, and the suspicious communications that suggested she was sharing confidential information with competitors. I started keeping detailed records of meetings, conversations, and decisions that demonstrated the pattern of favoritism and potential criminal activity that was being disguised as normal business operations. I also began researching Morrison Financial Services business practices more systematically, using my access to internal systems and financial records to look for irregularities that might extend beyond Sarah's individual case. What I discovered was even more troubling than I had expected. The firm was engaged in several questionable practices that bordered on fraud, including inflated billing for services never provided, manipulation of client account balances to hide investment losses, and creation of fictitious consulting projects to justify excessive fees. David Harrison wasn't just playing favorites with his mistress. He was running a criminal enterprise disguised as a legitimate financial services firm, and Sarah's rapid promotion was part of a larger strategy to place compliant accomplices in positions where they could help facilitate and cover up systematic fraud. My technical competence and ethical standards made me a threat to their operations, which explained the coordinated campaign to undermine my credibility and marginalize my influence within the firm. The realization that I had been working for criminals for 5 years was both horrifying and liberating. Horrifying because it meant that my career achievements were built on a foundation of corruption and deception. Liberating because it meant that my professional struggles weren't the result of personal inadequacy or failure to adapt to changing workplace dynamics. I was being pushed out because honest employees posed an existential threat to a criminal conspiracy that depended on silence and compliance from its participants. As I sat in that conference room, picking up the pieces of my broken coffee mug while listening to Sarah accept congratulations for her latest undeserved promotion, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being the victim of other people's criminal ambitions. I was done allowing corrupt individuals to destroy my career while enriching themselves through fraud and deception. And I was definitely done pretending that Sarah Chen was anything other than an accomplice in a scheme that was stealing money from clients and destroying the lives of honest employees. The game was about to change, and this time I was going to be the one making the rules. Sarah and David had no idea what kind of evidence I had been gathering or how thoroughly I understood their criminal operations. They thought they had successfully neutralized me as a threat, relegated me to a harmless supporting role while they continued their fraudulent activities with impunity. They were about to learn how wrong they were about that assumption. And when the truth finally came out, everyone would understand exactly who the real criminal masterminds were and who had been fighting to protect the integrity of our profession all along. The coffee mug was broken, but my resolve had never been stronger. I started my investigation the very next morning, arriving at the office 2 hours before anyone else and using my keycard access to explore areas of the building that were normally off limits to analysts. The executive floor was eerily quiet. At 6 in the morning, with only the hum of computers and the distant sound of cleaning crews working their way through the lower levels. David's corner office was locked, but the adjacent conference room where he often held private meetings was accessible, and I spent 45 minutes photographing documents that had been carelessly left on the table from the previous evenings. Executive session. What I found confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed the scope of corruption that extended far beyond Sarah's undeserved promotion. Morrison Financial Services wasn't just enabling one woman's career advancement through sexual favoritism. The firm was systematically defrauding clients through a complex network of inflated billing, phantom consulting services, and investment manipulation that had been generating millions in illegal profits over the past 3 years. The documents detailed a sophisticated scheme where client accounts were being charged for services that were never provided, with the excess revenue being funneled through shell companies controlled by David and several other senior partners. Sarah's role wasn't limited to being David's mistress and unqualified beneficiary of workplace favoritism. She was actively participating in the fraud by creating false documentation, manipulating client communications, and serving as a liaison with external accomplices who helped launder the stolen money through offshore accounts. I photographed everything I could find, using my phone's camera to capture financial statements, email correspondence, and internal memos that detailed the mechanics of their criminal operations. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew that photocopies alone wouldn't be sufficient to trigger a serious investigation. I needed to gather more comprehensive documentation and establish a clear timeline of criminal activities that would be compelling to federal prosecutors. Over the next 2 weeks, I developed a systematic approach to gathering evidence while maintaining my normal work responsibilities and avoiding suspicion from my colleagues. I arrived early and stayed late, using the additional time to access computer systems and file cabinets that contained sensitive information about client accounts and internal financial operations. I memorized passwords by observing colleagues enter them, identified security vulnerabilities in our document management systems, and gradually assembled a comprehensive picture of how the fraud was being executed and concealed. The most damaging evidence came from David's personal computer, which he often left unlocked during brief absences from his office. I discovered a hidden folder containing correspondence with offshore banking institutions, detailed records of cash transfers to shell companies, and a spreadsheet tracking the distribution of fraudulent profits among the participating partners. The spreadsheet was particularly incriminating because it showed not only the total amount of money stolen from clients but also how the proceeds were being divided among the conspirators based on their roles in the scheme. Sarah's involvement was more extensive than I had initially realized. According to the internal documents, she had been recruited specifically for her willingness to participate in criminal activities rather than for any legitimate professional qualifications. Her previous employment gaps weren't the result of career exploration or personal circumstances. She had been terminated from multiple positions for financial misconduct and had spent several years working for companies that were later investigated for fraud and money laundering. David hadn't discovered Sarah's talents through normal hiring processes. He had been introduced to her through a network of individuals who specialized in placing accomplices within legitimate businesses to facilitate white-collar crime. Sarah's rapid advancement at Morrison wasn't recognition of her capabilities. It was payment for her participation in criminal activities and assurance that she would remain loyal to the conspiracy rather than becoming a potential whistleblower. The revelation that my workplace was essentially a front for organized criminal activity was both devastating and energizing. Devastating because it meant that everything I had believed about my professional environment was false, that my colleagues were criminals, and that my career achievements were tainted by association with fraud and corruption. Energizing because it meant that I had the opportunity to expose major criminal activity and protect innocent clients from further victimization. I began researching federal whistleblower protection laws and procedures for reporting white-collar crime to appropriate authorities. The FBI's website provided detailed information about how to submit evidence of financial fraud, including guidelines for documenting criminal activities and protecting oneself from retaliation during investigations. I learned that financial services companies were subject to strict regulatory oversight and that violations of client trust could result in both criminal charges and civil penalties that would effectively destroy the firm's ability to operate. The challenge was gathering evidence comprehensive enough to trigger immediate action from law enforcement while avoiding detection by the criminals who controlled every aspect of my work environment. David and his accomplices had access to all internal communications, could monitor my computer activity, and were already suspicious about my attitude and potential for causing trouble. I needed to be extraordinarily careful about how I collected and preserved evidence while appearing to continue my normal job responsibilities without any indication of ulterior motives. I developed a routine of staying late several evenings each week, officially to work on client projects but actually to access sensitive computer systems and document management databases when the office was mostly empty. I memorized security codes by watching colleagues enter them, identified which executives left their computers unlocked during evening hours, and gradually mapped out the locations of the most incriminating evidence within the firm's digital and physical filing systems. The breakthrough came when I discovered that David was planning to expand the fraud operations by recruiting additional accomplices and targeting larger client accounts for systematic theft. A confidential memo outlined plans to hire several new analysts who would be selected based on their financial desperation and willingness to participate in criminal activities rather than their professional qualifications. The memo also detailed strategies for identifying wealthy clients whose account complexity would make it difficult to detect unauthorized transfers and inflated billing. Sarah was being promoted not just as a reward for her criminal participation, but as preparation for managing the expanded fraud operations. Her new role as regional director would give her access to client accounts across multiple states, allowing the conspiracy to scale their criminal activities beyond what was possible with their current limited scope. The Pacific Northwest expansion wasn't a legitimate business initiative. It was a plan to establish new territories for systematic client fraud using Sarah's connections with criminal networks in other cities. I realized that I was witnessing the planning stages of a major expansion of criminal activity that would victimize hundreds of additional clients and potentially destroy the financial security of families and businesses across the region. The urgency of the situation demanded immediate action, but I also understood that premature exposure of the conspiracy could allow the criminals to destroy evidence and escape prosecution while leaving their victims without recourse for recovering stolen money. I spent several sleepless nights weighing my options and considering the potential consequences of different approaches to exposing the fraud. Reporting the crimes immediately would protect future victims but might allow current criminals to escape with money they had already stolen. Waiting to gather more comprehensive evidence would strengthen the eventual prosecution but would also enable additional crimes against innocent clients who trusted Morrison Financial Services to protect their interests. The decision became clearer when I discovered that David was planning to accelerate the timeline for the expansion project due to what he described in internal communications as increased regulatory scrutiny from state financial oversight agencies. Several clients had apparently complained to state authorities about unexplained charges on their accounts, and there were indications that regulators were beginning to investigate Morrison's billing practices more closely than usual. David's response to the regulatory pressure wasn't to modify or abandon the fraudulent activities. Instead, he was planning to intensify the theft operations and transfer larger amounts of money to offshore accounts before investigators could freeze domestic assets or obtain warrants to examine internal records. The memo I discovered indicated that David intended to steal as much money as possible over the next 6 months and then shut down Morrison Financial Services entirely, leaving clients with worthless accounts and employees with terminated positions while the partners escaped to countries without extradition treaties. Sarah's promotion was part of this accelerated timeline, positioning her to manage the intensified fraud operations while David and other senior partners focused on transferring assets and planning their eventual departure from the United States. The expansion into the Pacific Northwest wasn't intended to be a long-term business strategy. It was designed to provide additional sources of money to steal during the final phase of their criminal enterprise before they abandoned everything and disappeared with their accumulated profits. This revelation convinced me that immediate action was necessary regardless of whether I had gathered every possible piece of evidence. Waiting longer would enable David and his accomplices to steal additional millions from unsuspecting clients and would increase the likelihood that they would successfully escape prosecution by fleeing the country with their criminal proceeds. I had enough documentation to demonstrate systematic fraud and identify the key participants in the conspiracy. The time for investigation was over and the time for action had arrived. I spent an entire weekend organizing the evidence I had collected, creating a comprehensive timeline of criminal activities and preparing detailed summaries of each type of fraud I had discovered. I made multiple copies of all documents, stored digital files in secure cloud storage accounts, and prepared written statements explaining how I had discovered the evidence and why I believed immediate intervention was necessary to prevent additional crimes. On Monday morning, I called the FBI's Seattle field office and requested a meeting with agents who specialized in white-collar crime. I explained that I had evidence of systematic financial fraud involving millions of dollars and multiple victims, and that the criminals were planning to intensify their activities and potentially flee the country within the next several months. The agent I spoke with seemed intrigued by my description of the crimes and agreed to meet with me that same afternoon at a location away from my office building. Special Agent Maria Santos was a woman in her early 40s who specialized in investigating complex financial crimes involving professional services firms. She had extensive experience with cases involving investment fraud, money laundering, and professional misconduct, and she listened with obvious interest as I described the criminal activities I had discovered at Morrison Financial Services. Her questions were detailed and sophisticated, demonstrating a thorough understanding of how white-collar criminals operate and what types of evidence would be necessary to build a successful prosecution. I presented her with copies of all the documents I had collected, including the financial records showing unauthorized transfers, the correspondence with offshore banking institutions, and the internal memos outlining plans for expanded criminal operations. Agent Santos reviewed the materials carefully, asking specific questions about how I had obtained the evidence and whether I had reason to believe the criminals were aware of my investigation. The meeting lasted nearly 3 hours, during which Agent Santos explained the procedures for federal investigation of financial crimes and the timeline for potential prosecution if the evidence supported criminal charges. She warned me that participating in a federal investigation would likely result in retaliation from my employers and that I should prepare for the possibility of losing my job and facing harassment from individuals who wanted to discourage my cooperation with law enforcement. Agent Santos also explained that building a case strong enough for successful prosecution would require additional evidence beyond what I had already collected, including testimony from victims, analysis of financial records by federal forensic accountants, and potentially surveillance of ongoing criminal activities. The investigation could take months or even years to complete, during which time I would need to continue working at Morrison while secretly cooperating with federal agents and helping them gather additional evidence. The prospect of spending months or years working alongside criminals while secretly helping federal agents build a case against them was both terrifying and exhilarating. Terrifying because it would require me to maintain perfect secrecy while surrounded by people who had demonstrated their willingness to destroy anyone who threatened their criminal operations. Exhilarating because it would give me the opportunity to play a direct role in bringing these criminals to justice and protecting their innocent victims from further harm. Agent Santos concluded our meeting by emphasizing that my decision to cooperate with the federal investigation was voluntary, and that I should take time to consider the personal and professional risks involved before making a final commitment. She provided me with secure communication methods and emergency contact procedures that would allow me to report immediate threats or urgent developments without compromising the investigation. She also warned me that any attempt to confront the criminals directly or expose their activities prematurely could endanger both the investigation and my personal safety. I returned to work the next morning with a strange mixture of anxiety and confidence, knowing that I was now officially cooperating with federal law enforcement while continuing to work alongside the criminals who had no idea their activities were being investigated. Every interaction with David and Sarah took on new significance as I gathered intelligence for the FBI while maintaining the appearance of normal workplace relationships. The next few weeks were among the most stressful of my life, as I balanced my regular job responsibilities with my secret role as a federal informant while trying to avoid any behavior that might alert the criminals to the ongoing investigation. I continued documenting additional evidence as I discovered it, but I was much more careful about how I accessed sensitive information and how I communicated with Agent Santos about new developments. Sarah's behavior became increasingly suspicious. As she settled into her new role as regional director, with frequent private meetings with David and extended business trips that seemed to have no legitimate purpose related to client services or business development, I overheard several phone conversations where she discussed financial transactions and timeline adjustments using language that seemed designed to avoid specific references to illegal activities while still communicating essential information to criminal accomplices. David's demeanor also changed noticeably during this period, with increased nervousness and frequent discussions about contingency planning and risk management that had nothing to do with normal business operations. He began working longer hours and scheduling more meetings outside the office, behaviors that suggested he was accelerating his criminal activities in preparation for the eventual shutdown of Morrison Financial Services. The most disturbing development came when I discovered that David had been researching federal whistleblower laws and investigating methods for identifying potential informants within the firm. A document I found in his office outlined strategies for monitoring employee communications, detecting unusual behavior patterns, and neutralizing threats from workers who might be tempted to report criminal activities to authorities. This discovery made it clear that David was aware of the possibility that someone within the firm might be cooperating with law enforcement, even if he didn't know specifically that I was the informant. The document included references to my name and suggestions that my recent behavior warranted closer monitoring due to my previous complaints about Sarah's promotion and my access to sensitive financial information. I immediately contacted Agent Santos to report this development and express my concerns about the increasing danger of my situation. She assured me that federal agents were monitoring the situation closely and were prepared to intervene if there were any immediate threats to my safety. She also explained that David's awareness of potential whistleblower activity actually strengthened the federal case by demonstrating his consciousness of guilt and his efforts to obstruct justice. The investigation entered a new phase when Agent Santos informed me that federal prosecutors had determined there was sufficient evidence to begin preparing criminal charges against David, Sarah, and several other accomplices. The next step would involve more intensive surveillance of their activities and coordination with other federal agencies to prevent them from transferring additional assets to offshore accounts or fleeing the country before arrests could be made. My role in this phase would be even more dangerous but also more crucial to the success of the prosecution. Federal agents needed real-time intelligence about the criminals' plans and activities, which would require me to take greater risks in accessing sensitive information while maintaining perfect secrecy about my cooperation with law enforcement. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had my determination to see these criminals brought to justice. As I prepared for the final phase of the investigation, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that morning when I first discovered Sarah's suspicious communications with competitors. What had begun as workplace frustration about unfair treatment had evolved into participation in a major federal investigation of organized criminal activity. I was no longer just fighting for my own career advancement. I was fighting to protect innocent victims and uphold the integrity of the financial services profession. The criminals who had tried to marginalize me and destroy my career had no idea that their efforts to silence me had actually motivated me to become their most dangerous opponent. Soon they would learn that underestimating honest employees was a mistake that would cost them their freedom and their criminal profits. The investigation was entering its most critical phase, and I was ready to do whatever was necessary to ensure that justice would finally be served. The moment arrived on a Tuesday morning in October when everything I had been building toward finally came to a head. David had called an emergency meeting of all senior staff, ostensibly to discuss quarterly performance metrics and strategic planning for the upcoming year. But I knew from my communications with Agent Santos that this meeting was actually intended to implement the final phase of their criminal exit strategy and potentially identify which employees posed security risks to their operations. I sat in the same conference room where Sarah had received her fraudulent promotion months earlier, but this time I carried with me a small recording device provided by the FBI and the knowledge that federal agents were positioned throughout the building, ready to move in at my signal. The irony of returning to the scene of my professional humiliation as a federal informant wasn't lost on me, but I felt none of the helplessness and anger that had characterized my earlier experiences. In this room, Sarah entered wearing another expensive designer outfit that I now knew was purchased with money stolen from clients, her confident stride and practiced smile a stark contrast to the nervous energy that seemed to radiate from David as he shuffled through papers at the head of the table. The other attendees included 5 senior associates and 3 junior partners, most of whom I believed were unaware of the criminal activities but who would soon witness the dramatic conclusion of an investigation that had been building for months. David began the meeting with what appeared to be routine discussion of client performance and revenue projections, but I could hear the tension in his voice as he moved through topics that seemed designed to assess each employee's loyalty and potential knowledge of sensitive information. He asked pointed questions about recent client interactions, upcoming project deadlines, and observations about unusual activities or communications within the firm. When his attention turned to me, I felt the weight of months of preparation and the knowledge that everything I said was being recorded both by my hidden device and by federal surveillance equipment positioned throughout the building. David's questions were superficially professional but carried undertones of suspicion and interrogation that made it clear he viewed me as a potential threat to whatever plans he was implementing. "Emma, I wanted to follow up on your recent work with the Patterson Industries account," David said, his tone carefully neutral but his eyes betraying anxiety about my response. "There have been some questions from the client about billing discrepancies, and I need to understand exactly what information you've shared with them about our fee structure and service delivery." The Patterson Industries account was one of several where I had discovered evidence of systematic overbilling and fraudulent charges, and David's question was clearly intended to determine whether I had shared my suspicions with the client or anyone else outside the firm. I responded with careful precision, providing enough detail to satisfy his immediate concerns while avoiding any indication that I understood the true nature of his inquiry. I've been working closely with their CFO to explain the complexity of their restructuring project and justify the time investment required for comprehensive analysis, I replied, maintaining eye contact and professional demeanor despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. They seem satisfied with our progress and haven't raised any concerns about our billing practices during our recent conversations. David nodded approvingly, but I could see him making mental notes about my response and calculating whether my interactions with Patterson Industries posed any immediate risks to his operations. Sarah sat quietly throughout this exchange, but I noticed her studying my facial expressions and body language with the intensity of someone trained to detect deception and identify potential threats. The meeting continued with similar questioning of other employees, each interaction designed to assess loyalty and knowledge while maintaining the facade of normal business operations. But the atmosphere in the room grew increasingly tense as David's questions became more pointed and his demeanor shifted from professional courtesy to something approaching interrogation. The turning point came when David announced what he described as a major organizational restructuring that would take effect immediately. Several employees would be transferred to new positions, others would have their responsibilities significantly modified, and a few would be offered generous severance packages to pursue opportunities elsewhere. The changes were presented as strategic adjustments to improve efficiency and prepare for future growth, but I recognized them as desperate attempts to consolidate control and eliminate potential witnesses before the final phase of their criminal exit strategy. Emma, I think it would be beneficial for everyone if you considered taking advantage of our enhanced severance package, David said, his words carefully chosen but his meaning unmistakable. Your technical skills are valuable, but I believe you might find more suitable opportunities at firms that better match your particular interests and working style. The offer was a clear attempt to remove me from the firm before I could cause additional problems, but it was also the perfect opportunity to force David into revealing more about his criminal activities and true motivations. I had been waiting for months for him to make exactly this kind of mistake, and I wasn't going to waste the chance to gather additional evidence while demonstrating his consciousness of guilt. I appreciate the consideration, but I'm very happy with my current position and don't see any reason to consider leaving Morrison, I replied, watching his reaction carefully. Unless there are specific performance issues you'd like to discuss, I'd prefer to continue focusing on delivering excellent results for our clients. David's composure cracked slightly at my response, revealing frustration and anxiety that had been building throughout the meeting. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, clearly prepared to intervene if the conversation became more confrontational, but David waved her off and attempted to regain control of the situation. Of course, there are no performance issues, he said quickly, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself and modulated his tone. This is simply about finding the right fit for everyone's talents and ensuring that all team members are positioned for maximum success and satisfaction. But his explanation was undermined by the obvious tension in his voice and the way his hands trembled slightly as he gestured. The other employees in the room were beginning to sense that something unusual was happening, though they clearly didn't understand the true nature of the conflict playing out between David and me. I decided to push harder, knowing that federal agents were recording everything and that David's reactions would provide additional evidence of his criminal activities and efforts to obstruct justice. I'm curious about the timing of these organizational changes, I said, maintaining a professional tone while asking questions designed to elicit incriminating responses. Are they related to the recent regulatory inquiries about our billing practices, or are there other business factors driving these decisions? The effect of my question was immediate and dramatic. David's face flushed red, Sarah's carefully maintained composure disappeared entirely, and several other employees shifted uncomfortably in their chairs as they realized that serious issues were being discussed beneath the surface of what they had assumed was a routine business meeting. I don't know what you're referring to regarding regulatory inquiries, David said, his voice now clearly strained despite his attempts to maintain control. Our billing practices are completely appropriate and in full compliance with all relevant regulations. If you have concerns about specific procedures, those should be addressed through proper internal channels rather than discussed in general staff meetings. His denial was technically accurate but delivered with obvious nervousness that undermined his credibility. More importantly, his response demonstrated that he was aware of potential regulatory scrutiny and was actively trying to minimize discussion of billing practices that he knew were fraudulent. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice carrying an edge of authority that seemed intended to shut down the conversation before it could become more dangerous. David is right that specific operational concerns should be handled through appropriate channels, she said, looking directly at me with an expression that mixed warning with barely concealed hostility. This meeting is intended to focus on strategic planning and organizational development, not detailed discussions of accounting procedures. Her intervention was clearly designed to protect David from further questions while sending me a message about the consequences of continuing to probe sensitive topics. But her obvious anxiety and protective stance actually provided additional evidence of their criminal partnership and shared concerns about exposure of their fraudulent activities. I decided that the moment had arrived to force the final confrontation. That would either expose their crimes or convince them to make mistakes that would provide federal agents with additional evidence. I think there might be some misunderstanding about what I'm referring to, I said, reaching into my briefcase and retrieving a folder containing copies of some of the documents I had discovered. I've been reviewing some client account records, and I noticed several patterns that might require clarification for regulatory compliance purposes. The folder contained copies of billing statements showing fraudulent charges, email correspondence discussing offshore transfers, and internal memos outlining strategies for concealing criminal activities. I hadn't planned to reveal this evidence during the meeting, but David and Sarah's behavior had convinced me that the time for subtlety had passed and that direct confrontation was necessary to force them into revealing the full scope of their criminal operations. David's reaction was swift and panicked. He stood abruptly, knocking over his chair in the process, and demanded that I hand over the documents immediately. His professional facade completely disappeared as he realized that I possessed evidence of criminal activities and represented a far more serious threat than he had previously understood. "Where did you get those documents?" he demanded, his voice rising to a near shout that startled the other employees and confirmed that something significant was happening. "Those are confidential internal records that you have no authorization to access or copy." Sarah also stood, moving toward me with obvious intent to physically retrieve the documents, but I had anticipated this reaction and was prepared to use their panic to gather additional incriminating evidence. "These documents were obtained through normal business activities," I replied calmly, holding the folder out of Sarah's reach while continuing to record the conversation. "I think the more important question is why you're so concerned about other people reviewing what should be routine billing and account management information." The confrontation escalated quickly as David realized that I possessed evidence that could destroy their criminal enterprise and potentially result in federal prosecution. He began making threats about my employment and future career prospects, while Sarah attempted to grab the documents and demanded to know whether I had shared the information with anyone outside the firm. Their increasingly desperate behavior provided exactly the kind of evidence that federal prosecutors needed to demonstrate consciousness of guilt and efforts to obstruct justice. Every threat, every attempt to intimidate me, and every panicked reaction to my questions was being recorded and would eventually be used to support criminal charges against both of them. The other employees in the room watched in shocked silence as the meeting deteriorated into open conflict between David, Sarah, and me. Several of them began asking questions about what was happening and whether they should leave, but David ordered everyone to remain seated while he attempted to regain control of the situation. "I want everyone to understand that Emma is apparently engaged in some kind of unauthorized investigation of confidential company information," David announced, his voice carrying a mix of authority and desperation. "This is a serious violation of company policy and professional ethics, and I want to make it clear that anyone who participates in or encourages this kind of behavior will face immediate termination." His statement was clearly intended to intimidate other employees and discourage them from supporting my efforts to expose the criminal activities, but it also provided additional evidence of his attempts to obstruct justice and silence potential witnesses. The recording device in my briefcase captured every word, along with the obvious anxiety in his voice and the threatening nature of his warnings. I stood up slowly, maintaining eye contact with David while addressing the entire room. "I think everyone deserves to know what's really been happening at this firm," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline and tension of the moment. "The documents I've discovered show systematic fraud involving client accounts, unauthorized transfers to offshore banks, and inflated billing for services that were never provided." The revelation sent shockwaves through the room as the other employees began to understand that they had been working for a criminal enterprise without their knowledge. Several people began asking urgent questions about their own involvement and potential legal liability, while others demanded to see the evidence I was describing. David made one final desperate attempt to control the situation by threatening to call security and have me forcibly removed from the building. But his threats were undermined by the obvious panic in his demeanor and the growing realization among other employees that serious criminal activities had been taking place under the cover of legitimate business operations. Sarah pulled out her phone and began making calls to what I assumed were criminal accomplices or legal representatives, but her attempts at damage control were too late to prevent the exposure of their fraudulent scheme. The meeting had become A public confrontation where their criminal activities were being discussed openly in front of multiple witnesses, exactly the kind of situation they had spent months trying to avoid. I looked around the room at the shocked faces of my colleagues, people who had worked alongside me for years without knowing that their employers were criminals and that their professional achievements were tainted by association with fraud and corruption. Some of them were beginning to ask questions about their own roles and whether they might face legal consequences for unknowingly participating in criminal activities. The moment had arrived for the final revelation that would complete my role as a federal informant and trigger the conclusion of the investigation that had been building for months. I reached into my briefcase and activated the emergency signal device that Agent Santos had provided, alerting federal agents positioned throughout the building that immediate intervention was necessary. "There's something else everyone should know," I said, addressing the entire room while making eye contact with David and Sarah. "I've been working with the FBI for the past several months to document the criminal activities at this firm. Federal agents are currently positioned throughout the building, and arrests will be made shortly." The effect of this revelation was immediate and dramatic. David collapsed back into his chair as if physically struck, his face draining of color, as he realized that months of criminal planning had been systematically documented by federal law enforcement. Sarah dropped her phone and began looking frantically around the room as if searching for escape routes, while the other employees erupted in questions and exclamations of shock. Within minutes, the conference room doors opened and Special Agent Santos entered with a team of federal agents, officially taking control of the situation and beginning the process of arrests and evidence seizure that would formally conclude my role as an undercover informant. The investigation that had begun with my discovery of fraudulent promotion practices had evolved into a major federal case involving millions of dollars in stolen money and criminal conspiracy across multiple states. As federal agents placed David and Sarah under arrest and began reading them their rights, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, relief, and sadness. Satisfaction that justice was finally being served and that innocent victims would be protected from further harm. Relief that months of dangerous undercover work were finally over and that I could return to honest professional activities without fear of retaliation from criminals. Sadness that my workplace and colleagues had been corrupted by criminal activities that had undermined everything I thought I understood about professional integrity and ethical business practices. The confrontation was over, but the legal proceedings and personal recovery would take much longer to complete. David and Sarah were facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison, while I was beginning a new chapter of my life that would be defined by my role in exposing major criminal activities and protecting innocent victims from financial fraud. The broken coffee mug had been replaced by something much more significant: the complete destruction of a criminal conspiracy and the beginning of justice for everyone who had been harmed by their fraudulent activities. The weeks following David and Sarah's arrest passed in a blur of legal proceedings, media attention, and the complex process of rebuilding both my professional reputation and personal life. The FBI had seized all of Morrison Financial Services records and frozen the firm's assets pending investigation, effectively shutting down the company and leaving dozens of employees without jobs or clear information about their future employment prospects. I found myself at the center of a federal criminal case that would eventually involve testimony before grand juries, depositions with defense attorneys, and coordination with prosecutors who were building cases against multiple defendants across several states. Agent Santos had warned me that cooperating with a major federal investigation would consume months of my life, but the reality of living through the legal process was more demanding and emotionally exhausting than I had anticipated. The media coverage was both a blessing and a curse for my professional reputation. Several major newspapers and financial industry publications featured stories about the Morrison fraud case that portrayed me as a heroic whistleblower who had risked her career to expose criminal activities and protect innocent victims. These articles helped establish my credibility and integrity within the financial services community, opening doors to new employment opportunities and professional relationships. But the publicity also attracted unwanted attention from defense attorneys, criminal associates of the defendants, and various individuals who had financial interests in minimizing the impact of the fraud case. I received threatening phone calls from anonymous callers who warned me about the consequences of testifying against David and Sarah. My apartment was broken into twice, though nothing valuable was stolen, and the incidents appeared designed to intimidate rather than rob me. Agent Santos arranged for protective services and advised me to vary my daily routines while avoiding predictable patterns that might make me vulnerable to harassment or worse. Living under federal protection was a strange experience that made me constantly aware of my surroundings while limiting my freedom to travel or socialize normally. The criminals had been arrested, but their criminal networks remained active and potentially dangerous to witnesses who threatened their operations. The financial impact of the investigation was initially devastating to my personal economic situation. Morrison Financial Services had been shut down without advance notice, meaning that my final paychecks were frozen along with all other company assets. My health insurance was terminated immediately, and my retirement account contributions were suspended pending resolution of the criminal cases. I was essentially unemployed with no immediate income and significant legal expenses related to my testimony and cooperation with federal prosecutors. Fortunately, federal whistleblower protection laws provided some financial assistance for witnesses who suffered economic hardship as a result of reporting criminal activities. The Department of Justice arranged for temporary support payments while I searched for new employment, and several legal advocacy organizations offered pro bono assistance with employment law issues and contract negotiations with potential new employers. The job search process was complicated by my unique situation as a federal witness in a high-profile fraud case. Some potential employers were concerned about the legal complications and media attention that might come with hiring someone involved in ongoing criminal proceedings. Others were interested specifically because of my demonstrated integrity and investigative skills, viewing my whistleblower experience as evidence of ethical standards and analytical capabilities. I spent considerable time networking within the financial services community, attending industry conferences and professional association meetings where I could discuss my experience and qualifications with potential employers who understood the complexities of the case. The response was generally positive, with many professionals expressing admiration for my willingness to risk my career to expose criminal activities and protect clients from fraud. After 6 weeks of intensive job searching, I received an offer from Cascade Investment Management, a boutique firm that specialized in providing financial advisory services to high-net-worth individuals and small institutional clients. The firm's founding partners had followed the Morrison case closely and were impressed by my technical skills and demonstrated ethical standards. They offered me a senior analyst position with responsibilities for client account management and regulatory compliance oversight. The offer came with a significant salary increase compared to my previous position at Morrison, along with comprehensive benefits and professional development opportunities that would allow me to rebuild my career on a stronger foundation. More importantly, Cascade's business model emphasized transparency and client service rather than aggressive sales tactics or questionable billing practices, creating a work environment where integrity was valued and rewarded. My first day at Cascade Investment Management felt like a fresh start in many ways, but I also carried with me the emotional weight of everything that had happened at Morrison and the ongoing legal proceedings that continued to demand significant time and attention. The other employees at Cascade were supportive and professional, but I could sense their curiosity about my experience and their uncertainty about how to interact with someone who had been through such unusual circumstances. The senior partners at Cascade made it clear that they viewed my whistleblower experience as an asset rather than a liability, emphasizing that clients would value working with someone who had demonstrated unwavering commitment to ethical standards even when facing personal and professional risks. They encouraged me to share my experience with clients who were concerned about financial fraud and regulatory compliance, positioning my expertise as a competitive advantage for the firm. Working at Cascade also gave me the opportunity to help other financial services professionals who were dealing with ethical dilemmas and potential whistleblower situations. Several colleagues from other firms contacted me seeking advice about suspicious activities they had observed and guidance about how to report potential criminal behavior without destroying their careers. I became an informal resource for professionals who found themselves in situations similar to what I had experienced at Morrison. The federal prosecution of David, Sarah, and their criminal associates moved forward slowly but steadily throughout the fall and winter months. Grand jury proceedings resulted in formal indictments on charges including mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud clients. The charges carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison, creating strong incentives for defendants to consider plea bargains and cooperation agreements. My testimony before the grand jury was both satisfying and emotionally challenging, requiring me to recount in detail the months of investigating criminal activities while working alongside people who were actively stealing from clients and planning to flee the country with their profits. The prosecutors were thorough and professional, but the defense attorneys were aggressive in their attempts to discredit my testimony and portray me as a disgruntled employee who had fabricated evidence to seek revenge against supervisors who had legitimately disciplined me for poor performance. The defense strategy was predictable but still personally painful, as David and Sarah's attorneys attempted to rewrite the history of our professional relationships and characterize my integrity. and competence in ways that bore no resemblance to reality. They suggested that I had been passed over for promotion due to performance deficiencies, that my accusations of fraud were motivated by jealousy and professional disappointment, and that my cooperation with federal investigators was an attempt to avoid prosecution for my own alleged misconduct. Fortunately, the evidence I had gathered was comprehensive and objective, providing clear documentation of criminal activities that couldn't be explained away through character assassination or alternative narratives about workplace dynamics. The financial records, email correspondence, and recorded conversations spoke for themselves, demonstrating systematic fraud that had continued for years and involved multiple participants across several states. The most dramatic development in the case came when Brian Matthews, one of the junior partners who had been arrested along with David and Sarah, decided to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. Brian had been a relatively minor participant in the criminal conspiracy, primarily serving as a facilitator for offshore banking transactions and document falsification. His cooperation provided additional evidence about the scope of the fraud and the identities of criminal associates who had not yet been arrested. Brian's decision to testify against his former colleagues created a domino effect among other defendants, several of whom began negotiating their own cooperation agreements to avoid lengthy prison sentences. The prosecution case became stronger with each new cooperating witness, while the defense strategy of denying criminal activity became increasingly untenable as more evidence and testimony accumulated. Sarah was the first major defendant to accept a plea bargain, agreeing to plead guilty to federal fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation with ongoing investigations. Her plea hearing was emotional and revealing, as she acknowledged her criminal activities while attempting to minimize her role and blame David for initiating and directing the fraudulent scheme. Watching Sarah's plea hearing was surreal, as I listened to her describe criminal activities that I had discovered and documented while she was still pretending to be a legitimate business professional. Her tearful apologies to victims seemed calculated rather than genuine, designed to influence the judge's sentencing decision rather than express authentic remorse for the harm she had caused to innocent clients and honest employees. David's legal situation deteriorated rapidly following Sarah's cooperation agreement, as federal prosecutors used her testimony and additional evidence to build an even stronger case against him. His attorneys began signaling their interest in plea negotiations, but the charges against him were so serious and the evidence so overwhelming that prosecutors had little incentive to offer significant concessions in exchange for his cooperation. The trial proceedings provided additional insights into the scope and sophistication of the criminal conspiracy that had been operating under the cover of Morrison Financial Services. Evidence presented by federal prosecutors revealed that the fraud had been ongoing for nearly 5 years, had victimized more than 300 clients, and had resulted in losses exceeding $12 million that had been transferred to offshore accounts and shell companies. The testimony also revealed that David and Sarah's criminal activities extended beyond simple billing fraud to include identity theft, tax evasion, and money laundering involving criminal organizations in several countries. Morrison Financial Services had essentially been a front operation for a complex international fraud network that specialized in stealing money from affluent professionals and small business owners who trusted financial advisors to protect their assets. My testimony during David's trial was the culmination of months of preparation and emotional investment in seeing justice served for the victims of his criminal activities. I spent 2 full days on the witness stand, describing how I had discovered the fraud, documenting the evidence I had gathered, and explaining the sophisticated methods that David and his accomplices had used to conceal their criminal activities from clients, employees, and regulatory authorities. The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive and personal, attacking my motivations, my professional competence, and my credibility as a witness. They suggested that I had misunderstood normal business practices, that my cooperation with federal investigators was motivated by financial incentives rather than ethical concerns, and that my testimony was unreliable because of my emotional investment in the outcome of the case. But the cross-examination also provided me with opportunities to reinforce key points about the evidence and demonstrate my thorough understanding of financial industry standards and regulatory requirements. The defense attorney's attempts to portray me as incompetent or dishonest were undermined by my detailed knowledge of the case and my ability to explain complex financial concepts clearly and accurately. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all major charges against David. The verdict was a validation of everything I had risked and sacrificed to expose his criminal activities, confirming that the evidence I had gathered was sufficient to convince 12 ordinary citizens that serious crimes had been committed and that justice required substantial punishment for the perpetrators. David's sentencing hearing took place 6 weeks later, providing victims with opportunities to describe how his criminal activities had affected their lives and financial security. The testimonies were heartbreaking, as retirees described losing their life savings, small business owners explained how fraudulent charges had forced them into bankruptcy, and families recounted the emotional trauma of discovering that professionals they had trusted had been systematically stealing from them for years. When my turn came to address the court, I spoke about the broader impact of David's crimes on the integrity of the financial services profession and the importance of holding criminals accountable to maintain public trust in legitimate financial institutions. I emphasized that his actions had not only harmed individual victims but had also damaged the reputation of honest professionals who depended on client trust and regulatory compliance to build successful careers. The judge sentenced David to 18 years in federal prison, along with substantial fines and restitution payments that would require him to surrender virtually all of his assets to compensate victims for their losses. The sentence was longer than many observers had expected, reflecting the judge's view that David's crimes were particularly serious because they involved the violation of professional trust and the systematic exploitation of vulnerable clients. Sarah received a lighter sentence of 8 years in federal prison, reflecting her cooperation with prosecutors and her relatively smaller role in directing the criminal conspiracy. But the judge made it clear that her sentence was still substantial because of the serious harm she had caused to victims and her willing participation in sophisticated criminal activities over an extended period. The conclusion of the criminal proceedings marked the end of one chapter of my life and the beginning of another. The legal process had been exhausting and emotionally demanding, but it had also been professionally and personally validating in ways I had never expected. I had proven to myself and others that integrity and courage could triumph over corruption and intimidation, even when the personal costs were significant. The media coverage of the trial and sentencing had elevated my profile within the financial services industry, leading to speaking opportunities at professional conferences and consulting requests from firms that wanted to improve their compliance and ethical standards. I began developing a specialty in helping companies identify and prevent financial fraud, drawing on my experience with the Morrison case to educate other professionals about warning signs and protective measures. My work at Cascade Investment Management had evolved to include significant responsibilities for regulatory compliance and risk management, areas where my experience and reputation provided unique value to the firm and its clients. The partners had promoted me to Vice President of Compliance and Risk Management, with oversight responsibilities for ensuring that all client activities met regulatory standards and ethical requirements. The promotion came with additional compensation and professional recognition that validated my decision to risk everything to expose criminal activities at Morrison. More importantly, it provided me with a platform to help protect other clients and professionals from the kinds of fraud and corruption that had caused so much harm to innocent victims. The personal costs of my whistleblower experience had been significant, including months of unemployment, legal expenses, security concerns, and the emotional stress of living through criminal proceedings and media attention. But the professional and personal benefits had ultimately exceeded these costs, providing me with a career foundation that was stronger and more meaningful than anything I could have achieved by remaining silent about criminal activities. Looking back on the experience, I realized that my decision to investigate and report David and Sarah's criminal activities had been the most important choice of my professional life. Not only because it had protected innocent victims and brought criminals to justice, but also because it had forced me to define my own values and priorities in ways that would guide all of my future career decisions. The broken coffee mug in that conference room had been a symbol of everything that was wrong with my professional situation at Morrison Financial Services. But the investigation and prosecution that followed had rebuilt my career on a foundation of integrity and purpose that no amount of corruption or intimidation could ever destroy again. 2 years after David's sentencing, I stood in my new corner office on the 35th floor of the Columbia Center, watching the Seattle skyline sparkle in the late afternoon sun and reflecting on how dramatically my life had transformed since that morning when I first discovered Sarah's fraudulent activities. The view from my window encompassed Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains, a panorama that reminded me daily of the journey I had traveled from victim to victor, from silenced employee to recognized leader in financial ethics and fraud prevention. Cascade Investment Management had grown substantially during my tenure, expanding from a boutique firm serving wealthy individuals to a regional powerhouse managing institutional portfolios and providing compliance consulting to financial services companies throughout the Pacific Northwest. My role had evolved correspondingly, from senior analyst to vice president of compliance and risk management to my current position as chief ethics officer, a newly created executive role that reflected both my expertise and the firm's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of professional integrity. The promotion had come with significant increases in compensation and professional recognition, but more importantly, it had provided me with a platform to influence industry standards and help protect other professionals and clients from the kinds of fraud and corruption that had nearly destroyed my career at Morrison. I now served on several regulatory advisory committees, spoke regularly at industry conferences, and consulted with law enforcement agencies on complex financial crime cases. My office walls were decorated with awards and recognition from professional associations, regulatory agencies, and client organizations that valued my contributions to improving ethical standards and fraud prevention practices. The Seattle Business Journal had named me one of the city's most influential financial professionals, and the National Association of Certified Financial Analysts had honored me with their Distinguished Service Award for advancing professional integrity and public trust in financial services. But the most meaningful recognition came from the hundreds of clients, colleagues, and industry professionals who had contacted me over the years to express gratitude for my role in exposing the Morrison fraud and for my ongoing efforts to educate others about preventing similar crimes. Their messages reminded me that my decision to risk everything to expose criminal activities had protected countless innocent people from financial harm and had contributed to broader improvements in industry practices and regulatory oversight. The criminal prosecutions had concluded with complete success for federal authorities and substantial justice for the victims of David and Sarah's crimes. David was serving his 18-year sentence in federal prison, with eligibility for parole only after serving at least 15 years. Sarah had been released after serving 6 years of her 8-year sentence, but her criminal record and professional sanctions had effectively ended her career in financial services. She was working as a retail clerk in a small town outside Seattle, struggling to rebuild her life while making restitution payments to the victims of her crimes. The restitution process had recovered nearly 80% of the money stolen from clients, thanks to aggressive asset forfeiture actions by federal authorities and the cooperation of international banking partners who had helped trace funds transferred to offshore accounts. While many victims had suffered significant financial losses that couldn't be fully compensated, the successful prosecution and asset recovery had demonstrated that financial crimes could be effectively investigated and punished when honest professionals were willing to report criminal activities to appropriate authorities. My personal life had also been transformed in ways I could never have anticipated during the dark months of investigating criminal activities while working alongside dangerous criminals. The stress and isolation of serving as a federal informant had initially made it difficult to trust new people or develop meaningful relationships outside of work. But gradually, as the legal proceedings concluded and media attention subsided, I had been able to rebuild my social connections and explore interests beyond professional obligations. I had met Chen, a software engineer who specialized in cybersecurity for financial institutions, at a technology conference where I was speaking about fraud prevention techniques. Our initial conversations had focused on professional topics, but we had quickly discovered shared interests in hiking, photography, and travel that provided the foundation for a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine compatibility, rather than workplace proximity or professional convenience. Marcus understood the demands of my career and the ongoing responsibilities that came with my public role as a whistleblower and ethics advocate. He was supportive of my speaking engagements and consulting commitments while maintaining his own successful career and personal interests. Most importantly, he had never tried to minimize my professional achievements or redirect my ambitions toward more conventional personal priorities. We had been together for 18 months and were planning to move in together in a larger apartment that would accommodate both of our careers and provide space for the home office I needed for my consulting and writing activities. The relationship represented everything that had been missing from my previous romantic experiences: honesty, equality, support for individual growth, and shared commitment to building something meaningful together. The contrast with my earlier experiences of workplace harassment and professional manipulation couldn't have been more stark. Marcus celebrated my successes, encouraged my professional development, and never expressed jealousy or insecurity about my recognition and achievements. He understood that my career was central to my identity and sense of purpose, and he wanted to be part of supporting my continued growth rather than limiting it for his own comfort or convenience. My family relationships had also been strengthened by the experiences of the past few years, as my parents and siblings had watched me navigate extraordinary challenges with integrity and determination. My father had initially been worried about the personal risks of challenging powerful criminals, but he had come to understand that my decision reflected the values he and my mother had instilled in me about standing up for what was right regardless of personal costs. My mother had been particularly proud of the media coverage and professional recognition I had received, often sharing newspaper articles and magazine profiles with friends and neighbors who were amazed that someone from our working-class community had achieved such prominence in the financial services industry. She had attended several of my speaking engagements, beaming with pride as I addressed audiences of hundreds of professionals about ethics and fraud prevention. The financial rewards of my career transformation had enabled me to help my parents in ways that would have been impossible during my earlier years as a junior analyst. I had paid off their mortgage, helped fund my younger brother's college education, and established investment accounts that would provide security for their retirement years. The ability to give back to the family that had sacrificed so much to support my education and career development was deeply satisfying and meaningful. But beyond personal and family benefits, my professional transformation had created opportunities to influence systemic changes in industry practices and regulatory oversight that would protect countless future victims from financial crimes. I had testified before congressional committees about weaknesses in financial services regulation, consulted with federal agencies about improving fraud detection and prevention programs, and worked with industry associations to develop enhanced ethical standards and professional training requirements. My consulting practice had grown to include major financial institutions, regulatory agencies, and law firms that needed expertise in investigating and preventing complex financial crimes. The work was intellectually challenging and professionally rewarding, allowing me to apply lessons learned from the Morrison case to help other organizations identify vulnerabilities and implement protective measures. The most significant consulting engagement had involved helping the Securities and Exchange Commission develop new guidelines for financial services firms regarding internal reporting of suspected criminal activities and protection of employee whistleblowers. The project had required months of research and analysis, but it had resulted in regulatory changes that would make it easier for other professionals to report criminal activities without fear of retaliation or career destruction. I had also written a book about my experiences exposing financial fraud and rebuilding my career as a whistleblower and ethics advocate. Breaking the Silence, A Financial Professional's Journey from Victim to Victor, had been published by a major business publisher and had received positive reviews from industry publications and general media outlets. The book had become a resource for other professionals facing ethical dilemmas and had generated additional speaking opportunities and consulting requests. The writing process had been therapeutic as well as professionally beneficial, forcing me to reflect systematically on everything I had learned about corruption, integrity, and the personal costs and benefits of standing up for ethical principles. The book had also provided a platform to honor the other victims of the Morrison fraud and to emphasize the broader social importance of preventing financial crimes through improved regulation and professional accountability. My speaking schedule had expanded to include audiences beyond the financial services industry, as organizations in healthcare, technology, education, and other sectors recognized the relevance of my experiences to their own challenges with professional ethics and institutional corruption. The universal themes of integrity, courage, and standing up for what was right resonated with professionals across many different fields who faced their own versions of workplace misconduct and organizational pressure to remain silent about wrongdoing. Each speaking engagement provided opportunities to educate new audiences about the warning signs of financial fraud and the importance of creating organizational cultures that supported ethical behavior and protected honest employees who reported criminal activities. The feedback from these presentations was consistently positive, with many audience members expressing gratitude for practical guidance about navigating ethical challenges in their own professional environments. The impact of my advocacy work extended beyond individual education to influence policy discussions and regulatory reforms at state and federal levels. I had been invited to participate in task forces and advisory committees that were developing new approaches to preventing white-collar crime and protecting whistleblowers from retaliation. These opportunities allowed me to contribute to systemic changes that would benefit entire industries and protect future generations of professionals and clients. One of the most satisfying aspects of my transformed career was the opportunity to mentor other professionals who were facing ethical dilemmas or considering whether to report suspected criminal activities. I received dozens of emails and phone calls each month from individuals who had discovered evidence of fraud, corruption, or other misconduct in their workplaces and needed guidance about how to proceed without destroying their careers or personal safety. These conversations reminded me of my own isolation and confusion during the early stages of investigating the Morrison fraud, when I had no experienced advisors to help me understand my options or navigate the complex legal and professional challenges involved in reporting criminal activities. Providing support and guidance to others in similar situations felt like a way of ensuring that my own difficult experiences could help protect future victims and prevent additional crimes. The mentoring relationships often evolved into lasting professional connections and friendships with individuals who had successfully navigated their own whistleblower experiences or ethical challenges. This growing network of professionals committed to integrity and accountability created opportunities for collaboration on research projects, speaking engagements, and consulting initiatives that advanced our shared mission of improving ethical standards across multiple industries. My role as Chief Ethics Officer at Cascade Investment Management had also evolved to include significant external responsibilities that enhanced both my personal reputation and the firm's standing within the financial services community. I served on the board of directors for several nonprofit organizations focused on financial literacy and consumer protection, participated in industry working groups developing new ethical guidelines and best practices, and represented Cascade at regulatory hearings and policy discussions. These external activities required substantial time commitments beyond my regular job responsibilities, but the partners at Cascade viewed them as valuable investments in the firm's reputation and competitive positioning. Clients increasingly valued working with organizations that demonstrated commitment to ethical leadership and social responsibility, making my public role an asset for business development and client retention. The firm had grown significantly during my tenure, attracting new clients who specifically sought out Cascade because of its association with my reputation for integrity and expertise in fraud prevention. The firm's assets under management had increased by more than 400% over 3 years, with much of the growth attributed to referrals from existing clients who valued the firm's ethical standards and risk management capabilities. My compensation had increased correspondingly with the firm's growth and my expanding responsibilities, reaching levels that would have seemed impossible during my early career at Morrison Financial Services. But more important than the financial rewards was the professional satisfaction that came from building something meaningful and valuable while maintaining absolute integrity and accountability in all business activities. The contrast with my experiences at Morrison couldn't have been more dramatic. Instead of working alongside criminals who viewed employees as threats to be managed and clients as victims to be exploited, I was part of an organization that celebrated excellence, rewarded integrity, and viewed ethical behavior as fundamental to long-term success. The difference in organizational culture had profound effects on daily work experiences, professional relationships, and personal satisfaction with career achievements. Looking toward the future, I saw unlimited opportunities to continue growing professionally while advancing the cause of ethical leadership and fraud prevention across the financial services industry. Cascade was considering expanding into new markets and service areas where my expertise and reputation would provide competitive advantages. Several other firms had approached me about potential partnership opportunities or leadership positions that would allow me to influence even larger organizations and broader client bases. But regardless of specific career developments, I was committed to maintaining my advocacy work and continuing to support other professionals who faced ethical challenges in their own workplaces. The lessons I had learned about corruption, integrity, and the personal costs and benefits of standing up for what was right were too valuable to keep to myself, and too important for protecting future victims of financial crimes and professional misconduct. The journey from that broken coffee mug in Morrison's conference room to my current position as a recognized leader in financial ethics had been longer and more challenging than anything I could have imagined when I first discovered Sarah's suspicious activities. But every obstacle had ultimately strengthened my resolve and enhanced my capabilities, while every victory had validated my decision to risk everything to expose criminal activities and protect innocent victims. The most important lesson I had learned was that individual integrity could triumph over institutional corruption when honest professionals were willing to take personal risks to protect others and uphold ethical standards. The criminals who had tried to silence me and destroy my career had ultimately strengthened my determination to fight for justice and accountability, while their own corruption had led to their downfall and imprisonment. As I prepared to leave my office that evening, I reflected on the email I had received earlier that day from a young analyst at another firm who had discovered evidence of potential fraud in her workplace and was seeking advice about how to proceed. Her situation reminded me of my own early experiences at Morrison, and I looked forward to our scheduled conversation the following morning when I could share insights and encouragement that might help her navigate her own ethical challenges successfully. The cycle of mentorship and advocacy that had grown from my own experiences was perhaps the most meaningful aspect of my transformed career, ensuring that the lessons learned from exposing the Morrison fraud would continue protecting others and advancing ethical standards long into the future. Each new professional I could help and each additional crime prevented represented a victory not just for individual integrity but for the broader cause of justice and accountability in professional environments. The broken coffee mug had become a symbol of transformation rather than defeat, representing the moment when everything changed and the journey towards something better began. The criminals who had shattered it had no idea they were creating the catalyst for their own destruction and for the emergence of a stronger, more determined advocate for the ethical standards they had tried so hard to undermine. As I walked through the lobby of the Columbia Center toward the parking garage, I smiled at the security guard who had become familiar with my late evening departures and early morning arrivals. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to protect others, prevent crimes, and advance the cause of integrity in professional environments. The work was far from over, but the foundation had been built and the momentum was unstoppable. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.